For some people, liquor and love can have some of the same effects, okay? Make us a little bit crazy. And if we're not careful, love can begin to feel better than wine, and outside of marriage, it can become intoxicating and dangerous. We're starting today to dive in verse by verse through the book of Song of Solomon. I'll give you a little while to find it. It's a small book, 8 chapters, very poetic. This is a book that is so important for us to talk about. Now, I can understand the Jewish leaders being a little cautious with who had access to it, because I remember some of the first times that I found Song of Solomon was when I was in chapel service at my Christian school when I was like 11. And I found some of the verses, if you know what I'm talking about, chapter 4, chapter 7, and I thought they were really funny to point out to my friends. Of course, mature little 11-year-old Kevin thought they were really great. And we would laugh about it. But here's the thing. These topics are not a laughing matter. And here's why. Because if we allow them to, they can grip our souls and drag us down. If we do these things wrong, if relationships and sex and romance become our idol instead of following Jesus, if we begin to pursue our own pleasure over God's. If you were here last week, we got kind of an overview of the topic of sexuality and how to honor God with our bodies. Flee sexual immorality, glorify God in your body. We talked about how Paul says in 1 Corinthians chapter 6 that your body is a temple. If my body is a temple, and a temple is for worshiping, then what I do with my temple is an act of worship. So the question is, who am I worshiping? Every time I make a decision with something I'm going to do with my body, I'm either worshiping myself and my own desires or God and his desires. So which one is it for you? You have to understand. You have to constantly be asking yourself when it comes to these topics. We have to talk about these things because we're being exposed to sexuality and relationships earlier than ever before. Middle schoolers, high schoolers, elementary kids are being exposed to these topics. Sexual sin is rampant in our day. And by the way, not just outside of the church. Sexual sin is rampant in the church with professing Christians today. We have to talk about these topics. It's so important. Now, let me give you kind of a little bit of a background with Song of Solomon. Song of Solomon was written, most people believe, around 956 BC. 1,000 years before Jesus came, this book was written. What's amazing about the Bible, I think this speaks so highly of the Bible, is that a book that was written 3,000 years ago is still amazingly relevant to our day. That's the power of God's word. And so we get to go through this book as we learn what God has to say about all of these topics. And as we're learning about Song of Solomon, it might be old, but it's still super relevant. I think you're gonna see this as we go through this. The Bible tells us in 1 Kings chapter 4 that Solomon was a pretty prolific writer. He spoke, it says in 1 Kings 4, he spoke over 3,000 proverbs and wrote over 1,000 songs. But Song of Solomon chapter 1 verse 1 says that this is the Song of Songs. Literally, what this is saying in the Hebrew is, of all of the songs, this is the song. Okay, this is Solomon's Billboard charting hit. Okay, this was the song that he wanted us to really pay attention to. And he did a lot of writing. He wrote the book of Proverbs. Many of you have been reading that. He wrote the book of Ecclesiastes. And then, of course, Song of Solomon. And there's been a lot of debate over the years. I mean, you could tell, obviously, if the Jewish leaders were saying 30 and under shouldn't even read the book, it's obviously pretty controversial. There's very little mention of God at all in the book. It's got a lot of really kind of flowery, poetic language. There's some pretty erotic scenes in chapter 4 and chapter 7 as this couple gets married, and we literally are basically in on the honeymoon suite. You don't get a view like this ever, and the Bible lets us in on what's happening on the night of the wedding and then further on in their marriage. And there's some scenes in here that you're like, dang, that's in the Bible? Like, I wouldn't have expected that, you know? I mean, we're going to start with some things today in verse 2 that you'll see. And so here's part of the challenge. Not only is it controversial, but then there's a lot of debate on how you should even interpret this book. One of the leading ways for years has been that this book should be taken as an allegory. In other words, it's not a real story, but it's a flowery, poetic way of describing Jesus' love for the church. Now, here's a problem with that. Actually, lots of problems with that, okay? Like, I don't even know how I'm going to get to chapter 1, verse 2, let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, and try to tell you that somehow this is a story of how Jesus loves the church, okay? And like, I'm going to have a really hard time by the time I get to the sex scenes in chapter 4 and chapter 7. Like, I don't know what else to tell you besides Jesus really loves you. Like, I don't know how else to me, this seems like it's a little beyond an allegory, okay? A little past an allegory, I think. So let me tell you how we're going to interpret this. We're gonna interpret this as a real love story. I believe these are two real people, Solomon, and who we meet throughout. We don't actually find out her name, but she's called in chapter 6, verse 13, the Shulamite. She's from a place called Shunem. And so here's what's interesting. Shulamite is actually just the feminine form of the word Solomon. So you could actually say this book, Song of Solomon, is the story of Mr. and Mrs. Solomon. So we're going to be learning about their story of romance, falling in love, dating, engagement, marriage, life after marriage. All of those topics we're going to be learning about. And we kind of parachute right into the middle of it in chapter 1. In fact, by verse 2, she's already kind of daydreaming about Solomon. It's really kind of interesting. We'll get there in a moment, but this story, especially for those of you who are into like sappy love stories, you're gonna really love this one. This is like the Cinderella of the Bible, okay? Basically, just to sum it up, King Solomon owns a vineyard and has let the vineyard out to be run and taken care of by this family. There's a mom, 2 sons, and 2 girls. The Shulamite has a younger sister, and then, of course, her older, what we believe are stepbrothers. They're pretty harsh toward her and force her into manual labor. Does this sound like Disney probably pulled it out of the pages of the Bible, you know? Like, maybe Walt wasn't as creative as we thought, or he got it right here from Solomon, you know? And so she's forced into manual labor, and then one day this handsome stranger walks into the vineyard. She takes notice of him, he takes notice of her. It's kind of scandalous that the king would want a relationship with this girl in the vineyard, and yet they fall in love, and he promises one day to come back and get her, and she daydreams of that, and then one day he comes in this big procession, and there's a marriage, and we go on with the book and the story. And so it's this amazing story of them falling in love. And like I said, we kind of parachute right into the middle of it. Chapter 1, verse 2, she's dreaming already. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Now, what imagery that is, right? Love is better than wine. If love is better than wine, then that tells me it can probably become intoxicating, right? If love is better than wine, I would say that this girl, I'm gonna tell you that this girl is already, we're seeing it right here in verse 2, love drunk over Solomon, if you know what I mean. For some people, liquor and love can have some of the same effects, okay? Make us a little bit crazy. If you've ever been around somebody, I'm sure you haven't been the one, but if you've ever been around somebody who's crazy drunk, okay, you know that people get a little crazy when they're intoxicated. I was reminded of this years ago. I think when I was about 18, I got hit by a drunk driver in the Taco Bell drive-thru, ladies and gentlemen. She backed into me. We're supposed to be going this way. She backed into me. So I was like, what just happened? I just got hit in the drive-thru? I've never even heard of this, right? So I get out to check what's going on. I could smell alcohol. I yanked the keys out of her ignition. I was like, you're not driving this. I'm driving your car, and we're calling the police. So I drove her car around. I drove my car around. I called the police. She drunkenly picked a fight with someone in the parking lot. He pushed her. She hit her face on the pavement. It was not a good scene, okay? So a couple things. One, I have since repented of the sin of eating at Taco Bell, okay? Lots of bad consequences from that. Number two, you know what I'm talking about. Come on. Number two, I had front row seats of the reminder of how crazy people get when they're intoxicated. And if we're not careful, love can begin to feel better than wine, and outside of marriage, it can become intoxicating and dangerous. Here's the title of the message. Would you write this down? 2 words. Drink responsibly. Today, I want to just share some real practical thoughts on dating, attraction, romance, and even just super practical thoughts on boundaries and protecting reputation and relationship, doing all of this stuff God's way. You know, it's cool too. I didn't put this together until my wife told me this morning. September 2nd, 2018, of course, is today. 16 years ago to the date, September 2nd, 2002, she and I were just getting to know each other, and I had asked her which service she went to at the church that we were going to in New Mexico. I asked her which service she was going to. We went to church for the first time together 16 years ago today. We sat in chairs next to each other. We worshiped together. And then as we sat down and our pastor got on the stage, we found out we were in the middle of a series called Life in the Single Lane. And the title of the message was Finding the True Love of Your Life. I was like, that's right, girl. You know, it's so cool, though. 16 years later, we still remember some of the biblical principles that our pastor taught us then. And I can tell you honestly that even though we weren't dating just yet, it would start later that week because I'm a smart guy and I'm trying to be biblical, right? Some of the principles that we learned from that sermon, we put into play immediately when our relationship started, and it changed our lives and helped us to do things God's way. Let me tell you, I'm praying the same thing for you today. Some of you are single, some of you are dating, some of you are engaged, many of you are married. Whatever season of life you're in, I believe there are principles for all of us, especially those of you who are not married yet. I believe, listen, if you'll take some notes today and you'll pay attention and let this stuff soak in, I want to be as practical as possible to help save you from future heartache down the road. God's word has given us guidelines. He created relationship, sex, and romance. I'm thinking we probably need to learn how to do things his way. You with me on that? So that's what we're going to do. Song of Solomon, chapter 1. We're going to read the first 7 verses, and then we'll unpack it together. If it doesn't make sense and it's too flowery for your liking, hang on. Here we go. The Song of Songs, which is Solomon's. Let him kiss me with the kisses of his mouth, for your love is better than wine. Your anointing oils are fragrant. Single guys, take a cue. Smell good, okay? Your name is oil poured out. Therefore, the virgins love you. Draw me after you. Let us run. The king has brought me into his chambers. We will exult and rejoice in you. These are her friends speaking on. We will extol your love and love more than wine. Rightly do they love you, speaking to Solomon. Now she speaks up to them. I'm very dark, but lovely, O daughters of Jerusalem, like the tents of Kedar, like the curtains of Solomon. Do not gaze at me because I am dark, because the sun has looked upon me. My mother's sons were angry with me. They made me the keeper of the vineyards, but my own vineyard I have not kept. Tell me, you whom my soul loves, where you pasture your flock, where you make it lie down at noon. For why should I be like one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? Now, not only during this series am I going to give you plenty of practical things to write down, but single people especially, there's all kinds of biblical pickup lines in this book, okay? Like, I hope you're paying attention. I just gave you a free one in case you didn't know in verse 7. Here it is. Tell me, my soul, you whom my soul loves, where do you pasture your flock? I'm just saying, you could try it. I don't know. We live in an agricultural city, and so you never know. It could work. Where's your flock going to be? I'll meet you there, boy, right? I don't know. Write it down. It may come into play at some point. I want to give you 3 things today to write down as we go through this. Some super practical thoughts on attraction and dating and romance. Number 1, write this down. Reputation is more important than presentation. Verse 3, notice that she says this. Your anointing oils are fragrant, and your name is oil poured out. This is a visual. You're gonna learn throughout Song of Solomon, there's all kinds of flowery, poetic language that we kind of have to read between the lines and do some interpretation on to understand how these things apply to us. But when the Bible talks about somebody's name, it's speaking of their reputation, their character, what is known about their integrity. When she says your name is like oil poured out, what she's saying is your reputation, your godly character is refreshing like a sweet-smelling cologne. Not Axe body spray, I'm imagining. Your character goes before you and it's refreshing. It's like an oil poured out, she says. Again, this is the principle. What's on the inside is far more important than what's on the outside. Single people, dating people, I hope you're paying attention to this. Listen, because it's really easy to get caught up with how good they look on the outside and overlook that what matters most is what's on the inside. If you want a real easy way to remember it, write these 3 words down. Ready? Heart over hot. Heart over hot. Pay attention more to their heart than whatever else is going on the outside. She says, your name, what people know about you, your reputation, your character is refreshing. It's like oil poured out. Character is the most important part of somebody. Now, that doesn't make light. I'm not trying to make light of physical attraction. Physical attraction is actually a way that God has wired us. We're going to get to attraction here in just a moment. In fact, if you think about it, oftentimes, you won't even take the time to get to know somebody's character unless there's a spark, there's a physical attraction. It's okay. God actually wired us that way. But we have to be careful with that attraction. We'll get to some of those safeguards here in just a moment. I remember when I first met my wife, who, of course, at the time was not my wife, over 17 years ago. I was on staff at a summer camp. She came as one of the leaders. And I remember I was walking down the dirt road, heading somewhere at our camp, and their church had pulled in, and she was in the gym with their worship team rehearsing their songs for the evening. And I remember I was walking down the road, and I heard her sing. If you know my wife, you know the angelic voice that she has. And I remember, no joke, it stopped me in my tracks, and I was like, where is that voice coming from, right? I turned around, I got to go find out where this voice is coming from. So I just kind of like nonchalant walked into the gym, and I already was amazed by her voice, and then her looks. Like, she not only sounded like an angel, but she looked like an angel. And I remember seeing her like, yep, gonna need to follow up, right? You know what I'm talking about? Girl, where are your flocks gonna be at noon? Is what I should have said. Probably not. We might not be married today if I did. There's love at first sound, love at first sight. But here's the thing. A lot of people stop at that, and they're just attracted, and they overlook because he looks so good, she looks so good, I'm so attracted to him, that we overlook big character flaws or moral things in their lives because it just feels so good to be around somebody who looks like him or looks like her. And we get so caught up in the presentation that we forget that really reputation is what matters most. So when I got to know when I got to know Jen, and over the coming months, we started to hang out and we got to get to know each other. Here's what I learned. When I slowed down and I took some time to get to know her character, here's what it did. It validated and deepened my attraction to her. There was, and for many of you there will be, an initial physical attraction. But when I hit the brakes and slowed down and I got to really know who she was, I was attracted even more. It brought us together even further. And I don't think I can harp on this point too much because we deal with marital counseling all the time now for couples who rushed through this and didn't do this God's way. I'm warning, I'm trying. This is, I believe, a very loving thing for me to do, to warn you that if you don't do this God's way, and you get so caught up with how good he looks, how good she looks, not only your physical attraction, but if you get physical in your relationship before marriage, it'll fog your mind from thinking logically and clearly, and you'll begin to make mistakes and overlook things that you wouldn't have otherwise. And down the road, I promise you, you'll regret it. There are people who come to this church every service, both venues, who wish to this day that their spouse would come to church with them. Now, for some of them, the reason for that is they came to Christ after they got married. And now we're praying that their spouse comes to Christ. But for some people, they rushed the process. They were so infatuated by somebody's looks that they never got to know their reputation or their character. And now they're suffering the pain of rushing through these decisions. I can't tell you enough the value of making sure you know who this person is. Listen very closely. Don't marry someone for potential. Oh, he's got potential. No. Marriage is not a project. In the church, we call this missionary dating, okay? No, it's my calling from the Lord to date all the cute boys and bring them to Jesus. No, it's not, okay? Dangerous. Don't go down that road. Pump the brakes, ladies and gentlemen. Slow down. We get people all the time who request us to do weddings. This is one thing that many people don't know. We have to often say no, or at least slow, more than we say yes. Because so many people are trying to rush through this whole process. You don't necessarily have to say no, but you need to at least say slow and figure out who this person is. Get to know their reputation and their character. There's lots of pressure on how we look today. Verse 5 and 6, in fact, the Shulamite, this girl, begins to actually apologize for how she looks. Verse 5, you can read it in your Bible. She says, I'm lovely, I'm dark, but I'm lovely. She apologizes in verse 6. I had to be out in the vineyards working, and the sun has really tanned my skin. Now, some of you guys are thinking like, I got to get in on that tan sesh, right? Well, back in the Bible days, it actually wasn't a good thing. You didn't want to be tan. Pasty white was all the rage back in the Bible days, okay? And here's why. Because it was a status symbol. If your skin was like porcelain white, that meant you had enough money to hire a whole crew to go do all your work outside. But if you were the one in the sun, again, social status, it was, I'm too poor to be the one living inside, and I'm working manual labor outside. So even though she's focused more on his reputation, she seems pretty focused on her own appearance. And again, this can be a trap. When we begin to care more about our outside than what's on the inside and our character and our reputation. Jen and I, trying to raise girls in the day and age that we're living, we're working hard against this idea of all of this pressure to conform and look a certain way. My wife and I created a plaque for my girls years ago. We hung it up in their bathroom. It's Proverbs 31, verse 30. Charm is deceitful, beauty is passing, but a woman who fears the Lord, she will be praised. It's the first thing they see of my girls when they walk into the bathroom in the morning to start to get ready for the day. I want them to always remember, sure, make yourself look however you like, but bottom line is this. All of that is passing and deceitful. A woman who fears the Lord, a man who fears the Lord, it's that person that will be praised. The reputation is more important than presentation. So listen, you are more than your waist size. Guys, you are more than your bicep size. You are more than the amount you can bench press. You are more than a number on a scale. Those are not the things that define you. What matters is what's on the inside. Are you a follower of Jesus? Are you doing things God's way? Slow down and find out their character and their reputation and integrity. Number 2, write this one down. Attraction is God-given, but must be used with caution. attraction is God-given, but you have to be careful with this. Now, look at verse 4. She says this, draw me after you, let us run. You can get the sense, and you will over the coming verses and chapters, that she's kind of daydreaming. Like if she's in school, she's just kind of like staring out the window, thinking about Solomon. The idea here is she wants to be swept off her feet by this strapping, handsome man. Draw me away, let us run, she says. She wants to be swept off her feet. And now here's the thing. Desire, sexual attraction. Let me be clear with this. These are God-given things. So it's not necessarily a bad thing to be attracted and have desire for someone, but it's what you do with that desire that makes it sinful or not. Let me be clear, because what I want to try to avoid throughout this series is bashing sex. I don't want to bash sex. I don't want to bash relationships. I don't want to make them all negative, because these are God-given things. I feel like churches do this too much, where we're just only talking about the negative consequences if you do the wrong thing. We want to lift up the gifts that God has given us, but we want to make sure we're using them in the right context. You guys with me on that? You agree? Josh does. Thank you. So when we do things God's way, you'll find that life just works a lot better that way. Solomon actually writes about this in Proverbs chapter 5. Proverbs chapter 5 in verse 19, he actually says that within marriage, we should be intoxicated with love, in love with our spouse. Literally, Proverbs 5:19 says, you should be so in love with your husband or wife that it's like you're drunk. That's love, right? Like, you make me crazy, girl. You know, that's the love that Solomon is talking about in Proverbs chapter 5, verse 19. But remember, that's in the context of marriage. Before marriage, listen very closely, drink responsibly. If you get too drawn into lust and desire and attraction, it can become dangerous. Think about intoxication. What does it do? Intoxication heightens temptation and lowers inhibitions. You know exactly what I'm talking about. We start doing crazy things when we're intoxicated, whether it's liquor or lust. We'll do crazy things because we're just drunk and not thinking logically. And so we have to be very careful with this attraction. It's a God-given gift, but drink responsibly before marriage. She's wanting to be, she says, kiss me with the kisses of your mouth. This desire for her to be kind of like smothered in kisses and swept off her feet. Those are natural desires, but here's the question. What do you do with those thoughts? How long do you dwell on those things? Do they turn into lust in your mind? That's the problem. Did you know Jesus said that if you look at a man or a woman with lust in your heart, you've already committed adultery? So the initial attraction isn't the problem. God wired you to be that way. I was thinking about this week. Wouldn't it be pretty challenging for God to put man and woman together and say, be fruitful and multiply, if we didn't even like that? Right? Like, God built us so that we would want that. It's a God-given gift, but we need to make sure that we're using caution, especially when it comes to this season before marriage. When you allow lust to continue in your head, it turns into fantasy and it becomes a sinful thought. And you know what I've found? I've learned the hard way that what you feed in your head won't stay in your head for long. You'll want to find somebody to act it out with. This is problematic and dangerous. So again, I don't want to just beat down on the negative consequences. I'm trying to lift up the gifts of relationships and sex and romance, but we need to drink responsibly when it comes to thoughts and desire and attraction. It's this important. Here's the third thing. Would you write this down? This is super practical. Write this down. Make sure your location doesn't lead to greater temptation. I want to get just real practical here, talk through some boundaries, because I think there's so much wisdom in this. Look back at this pickup line that is verse 7. Watch this. She goes, tell me, you whom my soul loves, where you pasture your flock, where you make it lie down at noon, for why should I be like the one who veils herself beside the flocks of your companions? Translation, don't make me stalk you, boy. Just tell me where you're going to be, okay? Now, my wife will tell you this story. When I was in school of ministry, it was at our church that she also attended, and she worked there on staff. It was interesting because when our class would get off of breaks in between classes, she would mysteriously appear right around the area that our class would come out. And I don't know why that was, besides that she was stalking me, okay? And I would notice her, and we'd say hi, and then we'd just kind of like go on with our day. And I guess it worked, right? So moral of the story, stalk people. Really? No, don't do that. Don't do that. Don't do that. Did I say that? Don't do that, okay? Don't stalk people. It worked for her, but don't do it, all right? Here's what she's saying. She says, I don't want that. I think there's so much wisdom in this. Watch. She's trying to protect reputation and relationship. Here's how. She says, don't make it seem like I'm one of those women with a veiled face. What does that mean? In the Bible times, a woman with a veiled face was a prostitute. She goes, I'm afraid that if I don't know where you're going to be and I'm just kind of walking from place to place trying to find you, people are going to get the wrong idea about us. She goes, I don't want to give off the wrong vibe for myself or for you. Just tell me where I can meet you so it doesn't give the wrong appearance. Now, we've already talked earlier that appearance isn't the most important thing. But listen, paying attention to how your relationship may be perceived by others is very important. I'm trying to help you here. Is this practical for anybody? I'm trying to give you some guidelines here. I'm trying to help you make sure that you do things God's way. I've failed many times. I've lived on both sides where I served myself and I served the Lord. And I can speak from experience when I say God's way is the best way. It's not easy. In fact, it often goes against what feels natural, but it's the right thing. And that's what matters most. So we need to be careful with how people perceive us in our relationships. Big example for us today. Christians dating or engaged, living together before they're married. Now, I know this is controversial. Some pastors wouldn't even talk about it. I don't avoid controversial topics. Sometimes, though, I wish that there was a Bible verse that says, thou shalt not live together before you get married, because dang, it would make my job easier. Honestly, I'd have a lot less cleanup to do later. Why is this such a big deal? Well, think about it. People could get the wrong idea. And I know we've got all kinds of justifications about why you and your boyfriend, why you and your girlfriend are living together. I know you got all kinds of reasons. Come on, list them for me. You're right. I guarantee you can come up with any argument. The main one is we can't afford to live separately. Really? Well, of course it costs less for you to move in together. We could all move in together and save a whole bunch of money. We're not going to do that. Right? I found out that it costs a lot less for me to put water in my gas tank than it does gasoline. It's not going to work. That's all I'm getting at. It's going to break down. You're like, but it's going to cost us less if we live together. Well, here's the thing. If it heightens temptation and you ruin your witness, I'm thinking it probably costs you a lot more in the long run. Be careful with how you may be perceived on the outside. I'm not talking about living to please people, but I'm talking about stay away from anything that heightens temptation and makes it look like you're living in sin. What happens when you go to work, when you're in class, and your friends, your coworkers find out that you and your boyfriend, you and your girlfriend are living together, but you go to church and call yourself a Christian? What does that say about your God? What does that say about the Bible? What does that say about your belief system? It's important that we live above reproach. So set up some boundaries. She says, I just don't want it to look the wrong way here. She's trying to protect reputation. She's also trying to protect the relationship. Did you notice that she wants to get to know him, but she wants to meet him somewhere in public? Did you notice that? I'll go wherever your flocks are. Not in your bedroom, but I'll go to where your flocks are at noon. Wherever that might be. Out on the hillside, everybody can see us. Why is this such a big deal? Well, because if you've ever pursued someone in a relationship, you know that the longer you're together alone, the higher the temptation gets. The more challenging the temptation gets to fight. It's not worth it. Turns out, the backseat of a car, alone in a bedroom, or under a blanket are really bad places to fight temptation. Turns out, I know, it sounds crazy, right? But people do it all the time. They're like, we slipped, but you didn't even try not to. You know what I mean? Come on, let's just think logically here. If you're alone in your bedroom with that person that you like and you end up laying down on the bed together, this is a bad idea, folks. She goes, yeah, I'd like to get to know you, but let's hang out outside. Let's hang out in kind of like a public place. Let's grab coffee in our day and age, okay? Maybe in a coffee shop. We'll start there. I want to get to know you, but let's make sure it's done in the right way. Don't make it hard. It's hard enough to resist temptation. Don't make it harder as hormones are raging and emotions are running. It's going to be challenging enough. Don't make it harder for yourself. So hopefully what you're doing is picking up on this love story. And you know, when I think about it, I realize it's probably kind of scandalous. This is a king walking through his vineyards, falling in love with one of his hired servants. That's not normal. She doesn't deserve what the king could provide. And yet the king steps into her world and begins to tell her about his love for her. Does this remind you of any other love story you've heard? Reminds me of another scandalous conversation I heard once in John chapter 4 between another man and a woman. This time it was Jesus and a woman who appeared at a well. John chapter 4, see, in Jesus' day, Jewish men don't talk in public to Jewish women, and Jews of either gender don't talk to Samaritans. But Jesus, because he bought our souls and would spill his blood for this woman, was willing to bypass any man-written rules to speak love into somebody's life. And a Samaritan woman walks up, and Jesus sits down at her well and begins to speak about his love and speak truth into her life. And listen to what he says, John 4, verse 13. Jesus said to her, "Everyone who drinks of this water will be thirsty again. But whoever drinks of the water that I will give him will never be thirsty again. The water that I will give him will become in him a spring of water welling up to eternal life." He goes, you keep coming back to this well time and time again, and it seems like you must still be thirsty. But I happen to know some water that if you'll drink it, you'll never be thirsty again. She goes, tell me more. So if you've read the story in John chapter 4, you know where this is headed. And he begins to speak truth into her life. He says, go get your husband. And she goes, well, I don't have a husband. Actually, I'm living with the guy, and I've had 5 other marriages. He tells her about all of her problems, and she starts to realize, this is not just a normal guy that I'm with here. By the end of the story, I love it. By the end of the chapter in John chapter 4, her life has been transformed by the truth and the love that Jesus has spoken to her. And she goes to get other people from the village and bring them to Jesus. Listen to me real closely. I want you to know, Jesus is not afraid to bypass anything that would prevent him from getting to you and step right in the middle of your failure and your rebellion and your mess. Listen, he'll sit down at your well. What's the well for you? It's the thing you keep going back to that is leaving you thirsty. It could be your boyfriend. It could be your girlfriend. It could be pornography. It could be finances. It could be being known, having a great reputation. It could be anything that you keep going back to and drinking, thinking that maybe this time it'll be enough, Jesus will sit right by that thing, right by that person, and begin to speak into your life that you are loved, that he has water that will quench your thirst, that if you'll trust him, he says, like a fountain of living water will come bubbling up out of your life. You'll never be the same. And not only will he change you, but he'll send you back into your world to bring more people to him. He'll use you. Come on, is anybody excited about that? Golf clap for Jesus. That's what we just did. Come on, let's celebrate. Jesus wants to use us. Like in the middle of your failure, in the middle of your pain, in the middle of you trying to act like you've got it all together, Jesus knows you don't. And he sits down right next to you and he goes, I've got something so much better than what the world is going to feed you. You just keep trying the world if you want, but you'll always be thirsty. Jesus says, come to me and you'll never thirst again. I'll change you forever. I wonder if somebody here today wants that change. And I want to invite you into that today. We're learning today to drink responsibly. But I wonder if you've been drinking the wrong thing altogether. And today is the day to drink from the living water that will quench your thirst. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Kevin Miller Podcast. It would mean so much if you would rate this podcast on the platform where you watch or listen. That will help us reach more people with the good news of the gospel. As always, find out more at kevmill.com or follow on Instagram or Facebook.